Hello, this is Christian Dorer of Canto 1408, and if you listen to the last podcast that me and my friend Bill Burns did on the original Godzilla, we're basically doing an entire retrospective on the entire Godzilla series. So the first podcast we did was on the original Godzilla, because that kind of requires its own podcast, and now we're talking about the Showa era, so all the sequels from Godzilla Raids Again to Terror of Mechagodzilla. Now, even though you and me already talked about the original Godzilla, let's just quickly recap our thoughts on the original one.
Sure. I guess we're pretty much in agreement in that we both think it's a classic film. It's a much deeper film than I think the mainstream audience gives it credit for, and it's a cinema classic.
Yeah, I would pretty much agree with you. It is a much deeper film than I think the sequels would lead you to believe, because the sequels got progressively cheesier and cheesier, and I honestly, like, with the original Godzilla, something that I forgot to bring up, even though we kind of already covered it, was the whole fact that Godzilla in the original film, he's the immediate problem in that story, but you realize that Godzilla is just a symptom of a much larger issue.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I totally agree. And that's why I feel that in the first film, Godzilla is a metaphor.
Yeah.
In the later films, he becomes a character, which then, he becomes the immediate threat. He becomes the thing that has to be sort of responded to. Whereas in the end of the first film, even though Godzilla has been destroyed, you still have this lingering feeling that the threat is still there.
Yeah, because Godzilla is a consequence of nuclear war. Even though no actual nuclear war happened in the film, Godzilla, I think, in the first film is supposed to represent a warning of what will happen if these tensions, like, at the time it was the Cold War, so if these tensions between the US and Russia do escalate, Godzilla was really a warning, but it was also a warning about even nuclear testing, what it could do to the environment, and Godzilla is a direct consequence of all of that, of war, of what we're doing to the environment, and I think that's the thing in the original film. Godzilla, once again, he's a symptom of a much larger issue, and I don't think you really get that with the sequels.
Right, and I also feel in the first, I totally agree with what you were saying, I also feel in the first film, that consequence is also felt on the human level, which again, I think as the sequels progressed, it came away less and less from the human level, the suffering on the human level, more of the spectacle of explosions, destruction, which has its place, don't get me wrong, has its place in movies, but it's a very different tone, a very different feel, very different motivations than the first film.
All right. We should probably move on now to the first of the Godzilla sequels, Godzilla Raids Again, released in 1955 in Japan, actually a year before the first film would come over to America in the form of Godzilla King of the Monsters, and a few years later, in 1959, it was drastically re-edited as Gigantus the Fire Monster, and both edits of the film are so radically different that they're almost two different films in a lot of ways. But before I give my thoughts on Raids Again, what is your opinions of this movie?
Well, to be honest, I've only seen it, I think, twice. I think I've seen the Japanese cut and the American cut only once each. But maybe because I haven't seen it so much and I'm not so familiar with the films, I enjoy the film. I know it's probably not the most exciting of the sequels, but again, because I don't have the familiarity with it, I believe I feel that I can enjoy these films on a level that maybe I can't with some of the later ones, which I've seen a number of times.
All right. And I hate this one. I'm not a fan of this one at all. I think this is a bad start to the Godzilla sequel series, and honestly, I actually do hold the original Godzilla as being separate from the rest of the franchise.
I do the same.
So, and I feel like if you're looking at this as the beginning, because to me this is the beginning of Godzilla as a franchise. Obviously it's not the first film, but it's the beginning of the franchising of the character, but to me it's a poor beginning. My issues with this film is I think it tries way too hard to be like the first one, but the first one, because of how Honda directed it, and because Honda felt so strongly that nuclear weapons will be man's undoing, the film has that almost documentary style to it, whereas this film feels so much more like a B movie. It feels more in the tone of the American monster movies, I think. And another issue I have is the human drama in the film. Now, in the first film, the human drama was just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the monster's story. In this film, I find the human drama to be boring as sin.
No, absolutely. I can understand that. Again, I think that this film really probably came out of Toho's wish to make the film, the idea of Godzilla more palatable for other countries, maybe for really looking towards the United States. I mean, if they had made another film that was documentary, that was so heavy, that was so focused on suffering and this sort of impending doom, I don't know if they would have been able to market that again, you know what I mean, after the first film. But again, I like I said, I don't dislike the film as much as you do. I love Anguirus. I think he's a really cool monster.
Yeah, no, I like Anguirus too, and I do respect this film because this was the beginning of a tradition that will follow throughout the rest of the series, the monster battles. I respect it, I hate it.
Right. Well, it's funny, but one of the things I do admire about the film is that they don't gloss over the first film, which they could very easily have done, right? You know.
Oh no, this very much is in continuity with the first film. Even Takashi Shimura's character from the first film makes a brief appearance in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And they even explain that this is a different Godzilla than the one that was in the first film, you know. And then I think that's one of the reasons also why they retitled it for the U.S. market, right? Because if they had seen the first Godzilla and it, you know, in the first Godzilla, of course, dies at the end of that film, that this would be a different creature. So I guess maybe to avoid any confusion, maybe that's why they retitled it Gigantus, or maybe they were just going for a more exploitive title. I'm not sure.
I'm a little more cynical with that. I think the producer was probably just an idiot. The American producer, I mean. Because at the time, Godzilla was not the franchise character he is now, and I think he just felt like, this is just some obscure Japanese movie. Nobody even remembers Godzilla King of the Monsters. Nobody. I'm pretty sure he just did it because I think he thought he was being clever. I don't know, but I'm not as optimistic as you on the producer's intentions for this movie.
Well, one of the things that the American cut does have, of course, is one of George Takei's first roles, or one of his first sort of
he does the voice work for the dubbing. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, which is always good.
Yeah, and overall, I'm just not a fan of this one. I find it to be terribly boring. The Japanese cut I find to be boring. The American cut, Gigantus of the Fire Monster, I think is bad on a different level. It's bad on more of the level of, the way a movie on Mystery Science Theater is bad. It's the kind of movie that you can riff on, whereas I just feel like the original Japanese cut is just boring. I find it to be a very boring movie. Once again, it's the human story. The human story is not interesting at all.
Which I think is something that recurs throughout the series. I think it became, especially in the early sequels, it must have been very hard to try to balance the human story with the monster story, knowing that, especially as the audiences got bigger and you had a more varied audience, where you had children in the audience, you had adults in the audience, trying to find that balance. I think that's one of the things that I think really stands out with the early sequels, the early Godzilla sequels. Whereas by let's say the late '60s, early '70s, I think that the producers were like, forget it, we're not going to try to do that. We're just going to go for the kiddie market. Whereas the early the earlier sequels, I think they really tried to appease the children. The adults, they really tried to appease and appeal to a much more of a mass, diversified audience.
Yeah. Although, even though I'm not a fan of this one, I actually do recommend trying to track down the classic media DVD of this movie, because it comes with this, what I think is a brilliant audio commentary from Steve Reifel, who's written a number of books on Godzilla, and he does this great commentary on the American version of this movie that is both informative, but also really funny. He pokes fun at the movie, and he recognizes that this is not one of the better Godzilla movies, and he kind of riffs on the movie. And honestly, whenever I watch this movie, I just watch the American cut with the Steve Reifel audio commentary. Have you ever seen that commentary?
I have not seen it, but I do have Steve's book.
All right.
That the unauthorized guide to Godzilla, I believe he put out, which I think
Okay.
he came out. I think maybe in the late '90s, early 2000s it came out, and it's a great book. It's an excellent book, and especially when you have a company like Toho that is so litigious, let's say, when trying to write about their films. For him to put out that book, even though he had to put all over the cover, this has nothing to do with Toho. This is nothing. That book is brilliant. It's a really, really great book, and I think he's probably the leading sort of Godzilla kaiju sort of critic expert.
And I'm guessing he made some kind of impression on Toho because they let him do the commentary for he did the commentary track for the classic media edition of the first movie, and then he did the commentary track for this one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess he made some kind of impression on Toho.
I guess so. I mean, he's got great insights, and he's able to talk about very critical, ideas and issues and topics in a very down-to-earth way.
Before we move on to King Kong vs. Godzilla, the third Godzilla film, I want to talk about two Toho giant monster films, both directed by Ishiro Honda, which were made as standalone films but would later get incorporated into the Godzilla franchise. The first is Rodan, which came out in, I want to say 1956, and then Mothra, which was 1961. To save time, I'll try to talk about both these movies simultaneously, and the only reason I want to talk about these is because the characters from both these movies will become so important in the Godzilla franchise. But what's your opinion of Rodan?
I think it's great. I enjoyed it very much. That's one I think also with the human story with the miners.
Yes.
It works really well in that film.
Actually, Rodan, people forget, that's a pretty scary horror film. Like, even the beginning when the miners are getting killed by what you find out are the giant bug creatures. It's actually a pretty good murder mystery in the beginning, and people forget that there's also two Rodans in that movie.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
But
but I think it's great. I think it's a really good movie. Again, another film where the human drama, the monster spectacle really complement each other quite well.
Yeah. And then what about Mothra? I'll admit I've only seen Mothra once, and I thought it was all right.
See, I think Mothra is one of the great sort of fantasy films of all time. I think it's a wonderful film. It works on so many different levels, and I also think it has a very different tone than, let's say, Rodan or Godzilla. And some critics have seen it as a more feminine tone. I've seen it a more less sort of not so masculine, not so sort of hung up on destruction, but more about like transformation, more about sort of.
And you also get some religious imagery in that movie, from what I remember. Like I remember at the end, there's like a crucifix at the end. Like Honda lingers on a shot of a crucifix, so you get some religious symbolism, which I think is interesting because. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Christianity is not as prevalent in Eastern countries as it is in Western countries.
Especially in Japan, right? Shinto, I think, was the sort of indigenous religion.
So, one of the things I find interesting about Mothra is there is this mystical background to her. Like, you don't know, is she a god? Is she an angel? Like, it seems like she's much more than just a giant moth. Like, there's something mystical about her origin.
And it's a beautiful film. The use of color in that film. In the same way, see, I think that it's after Godzilla, it's Honda's second greatest kaiju film. And I think it just for the very thing, and this shows you how brilliant Honda was as a director, because the very things that made Godzilla so great, it's almost the opposite of what makes Mothra so great, right? And where in Godzilla, it's very gritty, documentary, black and white, a very sort of brutal film. Mothra is the exact opposite. It's very soft. It's beautiful. It's mystical. It's colorful. It's just it just shows me how brilliant he was as an artist and as a director to be able to make two equally amazing films, but in two different styles, totally different styles. And I also love the Peanuts, the little princesses. They're awesome. They're really cool too.
And actually, I do want to point out that the first Mothra movie, I believe, is based on a book. I've never read the book, but I believe it is based on a novel, from what I heard.
No, I don't know anything about that. I don't know. But I think, like I said, I know Mothra. It's a little slow moving. I know that, especially with our sort of postmodern sensibilities. But I think it's a beautiful film. It's such an amazing sort of fantasy film. And again, I think it shows the absolute artistry of Honda as a filmmaker. because he was able to make an equally amazing film in a very different style and very different method than he did with the original Godzilla.
Yeah, once again, I only saw the movie once, so I might have to give it another watch. But now let's move on to the third Godzilla film, the second Godzilla sequel, and this is my absolute favorite Showa Godzilla film, not counting the original, of course, and that is King Kong vs. Godzilla. Much like the first two movies, there are two different versions of this, a Japanese cut and an American cut. What is your opinion of this before I get on to my opinions?
Oh, it's one of my favorite sequels of all time, not just for Godzilla. I think it's an amazing sequel. I mean, it brings together two icons, and it's interesting too because you could read a lot into the film about sort of the American-Japanese relations at the time, through two monsters. But again, that's what I think is makes the Godzilla series.
I heard a lot
of
critics point out the scene where King Kong's standing on top of the Japanese Diet building, saying, "Oh, this is symbolism of American dominance over." Could be. Knowing Honda, there probably is some political commentary. I just think they were trying to pay tribute to the original King Kong when he's on top of the Empire State Building.
I can see that. I mean, I feel more it's in the sort of the issue of the corporatization of Japan, of the greed, of the ratings and the merchandising.
Yes.
I mean, that's really where I see that with the critique of sort of the westernization of Japan is not so much. I mean, the monsters. I mean, it's a cool sort of image of two powerful beings, one that came out of the west, the one that came out of the east fighting. But I think more in terms of the satirical aspects of the film, which I think are brilliant. I think it's really good.
I do want to point out a lot of the satirical aspects are only in the Japanese cut.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to be honest, people are going to hate me for this. I actually like the American cut better.
Okay.
And I think that is nostalgia because you got to understand, the American cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla was my first Godzilla movie. I saw it, I think I was 3 or 4 years old. My grandparents had it on VHS. I saw it at the age of 4 or 3. This movie captured my imagination like nothing before. And it's what introduced me to both Godzilla and King Kong, and it's what made me into the hardcore Godzilla fan I am now, and that's the American cut. So I think specifically for nostalgic reasons, I do kind of prefer the American cut to the Japanese cut, but what is your opinion?
Well, I can see that. I mean, nostalgia is a very powerful emotion. But again, I think as a child, I probably I don't know for sure, but I would 99.9% bet that I saw the American cut, which I loved. There's so many great sequences in the film. I mean, the fight between Godzilla and King Kong is amazing, with grabbing him by the tail and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And then the parts in Faroe Islands when they go look for King Kong.
Actually, I want to point out Faroe Island. In a lot of ways, that's Japanese blackface because it's Japanese actors playing what are supposed to be black characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, also could be because I know that there's people down the Japanese. There's other indigenous people around around Japan. So I don't know if that's a reference to that as well. But when King Kong gets drunk and everything, and crazy and all that stuff. It's really fun, But again, when I got older and then I was able to finally see the Japanese cut, I really enjoyed that too. But on a totally different level, on a more intellectual level than maybe just the sort of the pure joy of the film. And again, that's why I think this is one of the great sequels because it works on both those levels. There's the joy of seeing monsters fight each other, but then there's also the satirical aspects of it that make you think, the more intellectual aspects of it.
Okay. Once again, it's for me, and I think purely for nostalgic reasons, I just kind of prefer the American cut, and I don't know, for me, and I've seen the Japanese cut only a handful of times, it just doesn't feel right hearing, even though it was the original music in the film, to me it doesn't feel right hearing Akira Ifukube's score for that film. I want to hear the stock Universal music.
I'm the exact opposite. I think this is one of Ifukube's greatest scores.
Okay.
It's amazing. I love the score to this film. And the suit was awesome. The suit they made, the new Godzilla suit they made for the film.
I do want to point out that Godzilla's look in this movie is my favorite look of all the Showa Godzilla films.
I can see that. Yeah, it's awesome. It's one of the greats.
And I don't know, for me, and I think the way the American cut is re-edited, I actually think you might totally disagree with me. I actually think the American cut kind of flows better than the Japanese cut.
I mean, honestly, I haven't seen the American cut in a while. the last couple times I've watched it, I watched the Japanese cut.
Okay.
But it's great. I think it's one of those films that it's so great it could survive alternate cuts.
Yeah.
And still be enjoyable whichever cut you watch, I also think it's interesting, right? This is one of the first films that really, where Honda really sort of had some dissatisfaction with the more childish aspects,
yeah,
right, of the characterization of Godzilla.
Yeah, this is probably, I would say, the beginning of what will eventually lead to the series getting geared more towards children, which I'm sure must have hurt Honda a lot, being that the first film is so close to him, because he was a soldier in the Japanese army, and after the war, when he saw what happened to Hiroshima, he became a pacifist, and he wanted to make monster movies to make a point, to make a political commentary, and he wanted them to be scary. But over time, they just started getting goofier and goofier, and a lot of that probably goes to the special effects director, Eiji Tsuburaya, who wanted these films to be geared more towards children.
And I think it's interesting that Tsuburaya had that much power at Toho. You know what I mean? That because to be able to
he's the one
dictate.
He's the one creating that effects, and let's face it. Even though the earlier films do have a lot of deep social commentary, they are very effects-driven movies. Right. So they probably needed him. No,
sure, absolutely. I can imagine that. The way Toho looked at it was like, there's any number of people who could be good directors. How many people are really good miniature, artists? How many good special effects artists? So I guess that's why he had so much pull there, maybe even more so than Honda did.
Yeah, I do want to point out how this one probably was a dream for Tsuburaya to work on, because he was such a big fan of the original King Kong. To actually do a King Kong movie, he must have been filled with joy, I can just imagine. And there is one stop motion shot where both Godzilla and King Kong are in claymation, which probably was his little tribute to
Willis O'Brien.
Yeah, Willis O'Brien's effects in the original.
Yeah, I can see that.
But once again, I adore this one. Specifically, I adore the American cut. I like the Japanese cut, but for me, purely for nostalgic reasons, I like the American cut better. Yeah. But I know you disagree.
Oh, it's not that I disagree. I prefer. I like both cuts, to be honest. I just, as an adult, I enjoy the more of the satirical aspects of the Japanese cut than the American cut.
Okay. And now let's move on to the fourth Godzilla film and the third Godzilla sequel, Godzilla vs. Mothra. Well, technically, I think the original title was Mothra vs. Godzilla, but later on like VHS, and I know some DVD copies called it Godzilla vs. Mothra. However, it was released in in America under the title Godzilla vs. The Thing. And I don't know if you ever saw the American poster for this movie, but it's the most misleading thing in the world.
I have seen it, yes.
Yeah, it's the where it looks like he's going to fight Cthulhu in the movie or something.
Which that would have been amazing.
Yeah.
Godzilla vs. Cthulhu.
But what is your opinion? Before I go on to mine, what's your opinions?
And this is another sequel I like a lot. I think that it doesn't stray too far from the structure kind of King Kong vs. Godzilla. There's aspects of satirizing commercialization, corporatization, right, about what they're going to do with the egg, and they're looking for ratings. So again, I like this film, but I don't think it doesn't really stray very far from the structure and the tone of King Kong vs. Godzilla. I also think too, right, I heard that the American cut of Godzilla vs. Mothra has more action sequences in it, and they put more missile attacks, something like that. So, because I guess they wanted to sort of
keep in mind, I've only seen the American cut of this, and to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there's too many differences besides what you said that they added some stuff. But this one, I do think is a great movie, and I understand why so many Godzilla fans consider this to be one of the best. I don't like it as much as other people, only because I didn't grow up with it the same way other people did. But I do think this is a great one, and what I like about this one is this does have a lot of the same social commentary that I think the original one had, obviously done in a much lighter tone, and a much more campy tone, but still has a lot to say, I think, about capitalism and the westernization of Japan in a lot of ways. I mean, the two main villains are these greedy businessmen, and I think it does have a lot to say about capitalism, and also it has a lot to say about the role of journalism in keeping corporations in check and in keeping governments in check and stuff like that. And it has a lot to say about nuclear testing and what we're doing to the environment. So once again, I do think it has a lot of powerful social commentary, very much like the original, but obviously tonally it's very different.
Yeah, I agree. I think it does it says a lot. And like I said, I really feel that it's sort of coming out of the King Kong vs. Godzilla film, where you had that kind of satirical kind of look at things, but also was saying quite important things about what was going on at the time in Japan, in terms of the commercialization of life there, the westernization of their society, corporatization, especially the media, the sort of how the media has infiltrated all aspects of their lives. So it's great. It's really good. And I also like the fact that you have sort of Mothra, who's this sort of feminine, matriarchal kind of figure, and then you have Godzilla, which is this sort of aggressive, kind of more masculine figure fighting. And that's really neat.
Yeah, and even though I do like King Kong versus Godzilla better, I do think this is the Showa Godzilla film where I think the Showa series really found its voice.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And then it's kind of lost it after that. But I agree. I think this film really is, it brings together some of the social commentary of the first film, but also has the spectacle, the grandeur, the fantasy of a film like Mothra, let's say.
Yeah. One thing I want to point out is, do you think this, because the film sort of picks up where King Kong versus Godzilla left off in a way, but I don't remember there being any references to the events of Mothra. Do you think this film could work as a sequel to Mothra, or you think this is more of a pure reboot of the Mothra storyline? I understand that this time they didn't really take continuity that seriously, but could you see this being in continuity with the first one at all?
I suppose. I mean, I never really thought that much about it, to be honest.
All right.
But I don't think there was anything in Godzilla vs. Mothra that definitely contradicted anything from Mothra.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty. Maybe there's a little thing here and there that maybe don't exactly match up. But yeah, I believe that you could sort of see this film as sort of a dual sequel, for not only a sequel from branching off of King Kong vs. Godzilla, but also coming off of Mothra as well.
All right. And now let's move on to Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster, which was actually released the same year as Godzilla vs. Mothra, 1964, which was also the 10th anniversary of the original film. I wonder that maybe that's why they made two Godzilla sequels in the same year. But this is one that I know is a fan favorite, and I do like this one a lot, but this is sort of the beginning, I think, of Godzilla becoming... This is the first one where Godzilla is outright an anti-hero, and this is sort of the beginning, I think, where you see the series get geared more towards children. But I do enjoy this one. I think it's actually quite funny. I would almost call this almost a satire of the first four Godzilla movies. But what do you think of this one?
I agree. I think if you see it on that level of it being sort of more humorous, more comedic, more of a comedy, I can get it. But this is for me is where I really see the sort of a downturn in the Godzilla sequels in terms of the human aspects of it. Obviously, in terms of the monster parts of it, it's great. It's got it's got Rodan, it's got King Ghidorah, it's got
this is the first one that introduces King Ghidorah,
right?
Too.
It's got some great effects work in it, really good. But it's almost like they took a whole bunch of different genres, like spy movies and crime movies and sci-fi movies, and let's throw a whole bunch of cliches at the wall and see.
And you see, that's something I really liked about this one. I actually really liked the premise that you have this princess who's possessed by alien spirits, and I want to point out that in the Japanese cut, she's possessed by the spirits of aliens from Venus, and then in the American cut, for some reason they changed it to Mars.
Right? Yeah.
But I actually really like the premise that there's a hitman after her. She's being possessed by this alien spirit, is trying to warn of King Ghidorah, which I actually think King Ghidorah... The way King Ghidorah is described in this movie, how the whole idea is that King Ghidorah travels from planet to planet, destroying every planet it comes to. It's almost a Lovecraftian idea. I almost see King Ghidorah as something that could have worked as a Lovecraftian kind of villain. Obviously, the film's much more humorous than the works of Lovecraft, but I could almost see a Lovecraft influence, at least with King Ghidorah. I don't know if you see the same thing.
No, I never really thought of it in that way. I guess you could.
Only because King Ghidorah is this thing that's traveling from planet to planet, destroying it. That, I almost see it as this supreme being cosmic entity
I mean,
almost.
honestly, I think I see Mothra more as a Lovecraftian.
Yeah, but
being
Mothra's on our side.
Right.
The whole point of Lovecraft is if there are gods, they freaking hate us.
Well, no, it's more of that they're indifferent, right? It's like they're sort of indifferent. But yeah, I mean, I guess you could make a case for that. I think more they could remind me of sort of like dragons, like from mythology.
Yeah.
That's where, and I think it's great. I mean, the look of King Ghidorah is amazing. I love the look of it. Look very regal. Like you can understand why he's called king.
Yes.
You know what I mean? He has that sort of regalness to him as well, that sort of power and that regalness to him, And yeah, like I said, I mean, I like the creature parts of it. I like the monster parts of it, the destruction parts, the fights part of it. The story itself, I think it has a lot of good ideas, but they don't really come to fruition. They don't really, for me at least, they don't really come together. It's more like they've said, okay, we're going to try to appeal to so many different people in our audience to get them to come in here. Like if you like crime movies, you can come in. There's a hitman in this movie. If you like, action movies, if you like spy movies, if you like sci-fi movies, we're going to try to appeal to everybody. And I think when you do that, it kind of gets watered down, and then you end up appealing to really nobody.
All right, and I still think I actually like it. I thought that's one of the things I really liked about the movie. And also, I want to point out that when Rodan first shows up in this movie, Rodan comes out of a volcano, which could be a direct link to the first Rodan movie. At the same time, though, I know at this time they didn't really take continuity that seriously, because it actually doesn't make much sense to me that the first Rodan movie would be in the same universe as the first Godzilla, because then how come they didn't reference the events from Godzilla and Rodan? But once again, I know they didn't really take continuity that seriously, but it's still cool seeing Rodan, Mothra, and Godzilla, who were previously characters from different movies, all in one film, and then having this new monster. And
I can imagine being a kid seeing this in the movie theater. Like at the time, your mind was blown. Like to see all these like monsters coming together and fighting, it must have been like so great to see as a child.
Yeah, and once again, I actually do enjoy it, and I do think there's a lot of humor in it. Once again, I find this film to be almost like a parody of the first four in a lot of ways.
And again, I do enjoy the film. I'm not trying to say that I don't enjoy the film. I just think it's a huge drop-off after King Kong vs. Godzilla and Mothra vs. Godzilla. I think it's a huge drop-off from there. Not in terms of the effects and the monsters, but in terms of the human story and being able to sort of enjoy the human story on the same level, or at least somewhat, close to how you would enjoy the monster story. For me, there's a big deficit between the two in this film.
Now let's move on to the sixth Godzilla film and the fifth Godzilla sequel, Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, released in Japan as Invasion of Astro Monster, later released in America as Monster Zero, but now a lot of VHS and DVDs of the movie just referred to it as Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. What is your opinions of this one? Well, I know you said last time we talked, because we did reference this one, that you weren't too big on this. But...
Right. Honestly, I think the costumes are great, the sets, the miniatures, the look is fantastic, really, futuristic. But to me, the story is just so boring. There's not enough Godzilla, there's not enough Rodan, there's not enough Ghidorah in it, It just is a melange of different plot points, and it just, for me, never becomes an engrossing story. It's very similar to my feelings about Ghidorah, the previous sequel, is that they just have all this stuff going on in the film, and I don't know if I lose interest or it's just not compelling to me, and there's not enough monster stuff in it. So it's the perfect storm of me sort of losing interest in the film. But again, I do enjoy the film, but I lose interest in certain parts of the film. But again, I love the look of the film. It's fantastic. It's an awesome look in the film, of the film, in terms of the futuristic kind of things and the space sets and the spaceships and stuff. It looks great. It's just the story itself, I think, that kind of just I lose interest in.
And you see, for me, I love this one, and I'll admit I don't watch it all the time, but I actually really do enjoy this story. I think it's a pretty cool alien invasion movie on top of being a giant monster film, and I actually do think there's some social commentary in the film, because the aliens in the film, you kind of get the implication that they used to be a lot like us, but it seems like they became so attached to their technology that they almost lost their souls in a lot of ways, and I think that's a commentary on how technology takes something away from humanity, which is a commentary I think is especially relevant even today. And also, you find out that there's a lack of water on their planet, which could be a commentary on what we're doing to our own environment. So I do think there's some social commentary in this. And also, I love the character of Glenn in this movie, played by Nick Adams, and I thought him and Akira Takarada actually had great chemistry with each other, despite the fact that they weren't speaking the same language at all, because in the Japanese cut, he's dubbed over in Japanese, and then in the American cut, Akira Takarada is dubbed over in English, and he was actually speaking English on the set during the filming. But despite the fact that they're speaking two different languages, I thought they both had great chemistry with each other.
Yeah, I think so. I can see that. I think Nick Adams' character is interesting. It's like he has like kind of this Brooklyn kind of like accent and tone to his, which is an interesting thing to interject, I guess, into a Japanese monster film.
You rats!
Yeah. But going back to like the social commentary part, see, to me it's kind of cliched. Like you could probably pick out any number like of 50s, even early 60s. Science fiction films that had very similar, plot devices about aliens, taking over the Earth, or needing these kind of things in terms of, or losing their souls to technology. It just doesn't gel for me. It just, like, to me, it's like I want more Godzilla. I wanted more like King Ghidorah. I wanted more Rodan, and I got more people like arguing in the film. It just didn't. It wasn't compelling to me.
Okay, and I do want to point out that Nick Adams in this film, the girl that he has a relationship with, who you find out is actually one of the aliens. That actress was also, him and that actress, I believe, were also in Frankenstein Conquers the World.
I believe so, yeah.
And apparently, like, they had a close relationship, Nick Adams and that actress, and he actually proposed to her. But I think because she was already betrothed to be married to somebody else, she turned him down. But Nick Adams, like, has had an interest in life, actually,
and a tragic death, right?
Yeah, unfortunately he killed himself, right. And I thought it was interesting. This is really the first Godzilla movie, not counting the re-edited scenes for Godzilla King of the Monsters, but this is really the first one where you see an American actor, an American character, as one of the main characters of the film.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah. What do you think of Godzilla's jig? Dance he does.
As much as I do like this film, that does kind of bring the movie down for me. Yeah. But wasn't that part of whoever came up with the idea took it from some manga that was popular at the time?
I think it was one of the co-stars in the film mentioned Subaraya about this and put the idea in Subaraya's head to have him do that. And Subaraya supposedly loved it. He loved it because, again, it would appeal to children. Children would think it was funny. Because I think he had a problem with scaring children. I don't think he wanted to scare children. He wanted to sort of amaze them. So I think this would have, because in King Ghidorah is a pretty scary character,
Yeah.
So I think by adding that sort of a moment of levity into the film, that he hoped to sort of, to make children smile rather than to cringe, or to cower.
Yeah. I do want to point out Godzilla's look in the movie, because in each film they kind of alter the suit a little bit. And this film, Godzilla looks kind of like the Cookie Monster.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's this great book. I think it's called The Pictorial History of Godzilla, either Volume 1 or Volume 2. It's this great book. I don't know if Toho put it out. And it's this big picture book. Like, it's got photos. And it's got these really close-up pictures of all the Godzilla suits. Up until maybe the Millennium series, or maybe a little bit before that, but it's amazing to see, so even something like that where like Godzilla might have this kind of strange look or whatever, when you look at the artistry of what they did with the suits and everything, it's still amazing. It's an amazing accomplishment to be able to do that.
All right, and now let's move on to Godzilla versus the Sea Monster, or Ebra, Horror of the Deep. Now, since I'm mostly familiar with its American title, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, that's what I'm going to be referring to the film as. And this is one that I think is really maligned by a lot of Godzilla fans. And this is also the first Godzilla film to be directed by Jun Fukuda, who directed several other Godzilla films. And I actually think Jun Fukuda is a very underrated Godzilla director. Sure, his Godzilla films are not as classy as the Ishiro Honda ones, but I actually think his ones are very fun, and I find this to be a very fun movie.
Yeah, I agree. I think he's very underrated. I think that his films have a very different tone, a very different feel than Honda's, but that's important. I think that if Honda would have kept making these kind of very densely packed, modern sort of, almost going into like, futuristic kind of films, it would have got old very quickly. So it's nice to have that kind of like break. And again, this is a more tropical film. It's not so densely packed with subplots and characters.
Yeah.
It's a very different feel of the film. And like I said, although I wouldn't put it up there with my favorite sequel, I do enjoy it very much. And I do feel that it's very underrated.
Yeah, and the way I see it is this one is just an adventure film. It doesn't have the social commentary that a lot of Honda's Godzilla films has. It's just a fun monster film. It's a fun adventure film. Mm-hmm. And I do want to point out that this was originally going to be a King Kong movie, but I think for marketing reasons, because Godzilla I think was a more popular character at the time, they made it a Godzilla film. But you could kind of tell that this was originally supposed to be a King Kong movie.
And I think coming out of that tropical, there's a very tropical, very different where with the Godzilla films, it seems to be very urban, right? The very urban, like Tokyo is being attacked, and like, it's very much about the effect on the city. This film is a much more tropical, much more rural kind of film, and you get to see Godzilla play baseball, which is awesome. It's just like such a great scene,
Yeah, I love this one, I really do. And I actually really like the characters in it, too. Mm-hmm. I find the characters in this one to be very likable, especially Akira Takarada's character in the film. Akira Takarada plays different characters throughout the whole series, and in this he plays a bank robber who you see join the main characters, and you really see him go through a real arc in this movie where he's a criminal in the beginning, but he helps these people and turns his life around by the end of the film, probably just because he's trying to survive, but you really do get the sense that he's a good person. He just made some really bad mistakes with his life.
Yeah, and I agree. That's again, I agree with that. I think that by simplifying the human story, because I think by the time Monster Zero comes by, the human drama is so intricate, and there's so many subplots and so many things going on, and there's so many twists and turns. Like, it kind of not only do I get confused by a lot of it, but it just kind of turns me off. Where this film seemed much more simplistic, but it made you sort of appreciate the characters more.
All right. And I do want to point out that at least the American cut of this film, because I know there are different edits of this film, because the old VHS that I have of this movie does cut out a few scenes that I finally did see. I finally did see the movie intact when I got the crack-in release DVD of the film, but I believe the American cut of this film is public domain, at least in America. I could be wrong on that. Of course, if you ask Toho, to them, there is no public domain to them.
That is true.
But I'm pretty sure at least one of the cuts of this film is public domain.
Was it? Well, I think it might have been watched on Mystery Science Theater, on an early Mystery Science Theater.
This was Mystery Science Theater 1. And I actually first got this one. My uncle gave it to me in this VHS set where it came with Godzilla vs. Megalon, which I believe is another public domain Godzilla film.
And was also...
At least public domain in America.
Right, and which was also watched on Mystery Science Theater.
Yes. Now let's move on to Son of Godzilla, another Jun Fukuda Godzilla film that is also very maligned, and probably for good reason, but I love this one as well. I really have a soft spot for this one. But what do you think of Son of Godzilla?
I'm kind of on the fence about it. I mean, I don't particularly hate it, nor do I particularly love it. I think, again, it's a nice break from the Honda films in terms of them being so... intricately, plotted, and like so much stuff going on, and the more sort of urban, more sort of, modern sort of feel to the films. Again, this film has another tropical feel to it. The only thing I'm not crazy about it is that I think in this film is where you start moving into the more sort of like maudlin kind of like, melodramatic, right, kind of feel to the film, where it's just like, cutesy kind of thing to the film. I really see that this film really started that kind of, that feeling of kind of the gooey kind of like, sentimental kind of aspects of the film. So again, I'm not crazy about the film. I don't hate it. I don't think there's any Godzilla film that I actually hate. And the one thing I do love about the film is the spider kaiju, Kumanga.
I love Kumanga.
He's awesome, yeah.
I want to point out that my VHS of the film, for some reason in the dubbing, they call him Spiga.
Yeah, that's what I first knew him as when I was a kid as well. Yeah. But I think he's like one of the few, like kaiju that is actually like really scary. Like he's like just terrifying to me. I hate spiders to begin with, so... He's one of my most.
See, I never had a
scary-
problem with spiders.
Oh, really?
My room's filled with them. So, and also I love the giant mantises. And
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Kamikaris, something like that.
yeah, I think that's what they call them. And people despise Minya. I don't mind Minya. I really don't. And I want to point out that I used to call Minya Godzuki because of the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla cartoon of the 70s.
I think many American fans that I did the same thing. I never knew. I couldn't even remember. I guess. Seeing the films, I did see Minya, in other films, but maybe I just forgot his name or didn't register with me. So I just, decided Godzuki would be the name.
Yeah, that's what I still sometimes call him. Even though I know he's Minya, I still sometimes find myself calling him Godzuki.
Isn't he also called Manila? Manila
Yeah,
or something like
Minya, Manila.
Yeah.
I heard it pronounced differently.
But again, I think it's a mediocre sequel. I don't like it as much as I like Godzilla vs. Sea Monster. When we're thinking about the more tropical Godzilla sequels, but it's okay. It's fun. At least it's fun. It's a fun film.
All right. And now let's move on to which I think is one of the best Godzilla sequels of all time, Destroy All Monsters. And this one was meant to be the final Godzilla film. History has proven it wasn't. But this one is not just supposed to be the final Godzilla film, but I think Toho intended this to be their last kaiju film, and you get monsters from other Toho science fiction films, like Baragon from Frankenstein Conquers the World shows up in this, and I think Varan, even though he's in literally one shot of the movie, but even Gorosaurus, who first appeared in King Kong Escapes, he shows up in this.
Manda, right, from Atragon.
Yes.
That big snake kind of monster. He's in it as well.
Yeah, and then of course you have all these monsters who first showed up. Well, not all of them first showed up, but all these other monsters from the other Godzilla films. And to me, this is just a great monster film. And here's the thing: as much as I love this one, the human story, here's the thing: I love the human story. I don't like the human characters.
Interesting. That's really
because I find the characters to be really flat, really two-dimensional, yet I'm still into the story. I love the alien invasion story. I love this whole idea that the aliens are controlling the monsters, and the whole film's really about the human struggles to try to take control of the monsters again. But the thing is, as much as I love the story, I don't particularly like the characters, though. This is where I find the human characters to be very flat.
Interesting. I mean, I can see that. I just think that there's so much great monster mayhem going in the film that it's as soon as if I get bored with the characters and I know there's going to be a great monster scene coming up afterwards.
And that's how I feel about this. Is I'm not a fan of the characters, yet I like the story, and I just love this movie overall. I think this is just... I know we're gushing over this one, but this is one of the best Godzilla films, I think.
I think it starts with the title. Destroy. That's one of the great... Not only a great title for, for the Godzilla series, it's one of the great titles in cinema history. Destroy... It's just a great title. Just really, people remember... If they remember anything about Godzilla, I think that's one of the things that they remember is that title. And I love the film, too. I mean, Monster Island's an awesome idea. How they've kind of corralled the monsters on this island. And it's cool is they even show you how they keep them on the island. Because, most films, they'd be they're on the island, who would even think about how they escape? They actually show you in the film, how they keep all the monsters, to stay on this island.
And I actually think the villains, the Keylocks, are very interesting villains, actually.
Yeah. Then there's in Godzilla Final Wars, right? Isn't that sort of a
they don't call them the Keylocks, but God's Final Wars was pretty much a remake of this one. But I find the villains to be very interesting. Once again, my only criticism of this movie is I do find the human characters to be very flat.
I have one other criticism of this film.
What's that?
And that's the part where you see, I think it's at the Arc de Triomphe in France, when they're showing the different... the monsters attacking different things. And they say Baragon's attacking, and it's actually Gorosaurus coming out of the hole. Because I guess the Baragon costume was either being used or or was destroyed or something like that. So they used Gorosaurus instead of Baragon. So that's the only thing. I mean, I know that seems like a very geeky thing to bother me, but, I can't help it.
Yeah, and overall, this is just such a fun movie.
Absolutely.
And you could tell it's directed by Ishiro Honda, but I don't think it has a lot of the same social commentary that a lot of Honda's Godzilla films have.
Maybe
but
some of the stuff with like space exploration, maybe in that way about sort of the dangers of of going out into space, or sort of not being able to control what happens with going into space. Maybe some of the things about space exploration, because you got to remember, like the next year, right? The Americans went to the moon, right? This came out in '68 and '69. So the space race was going on. So maybe some of that could be seen in what he was doing in the film.
But I kind of feel like this is the Godzilla film where Honda just let himself cut loose, pretty much.
Yeah, I could see that.
I believe this was the final time you saw Honda, Akira Ifukube, and Eiji Tsuburaya all working together.
Right, yeah, because Sarabi would die, right? Not too long after the film.
Yeah.
I think.
Mm-hmm. But once again, I can't really say anything else about it. I think it's just a great monster film.
I agree.
I think this is exactly what it should be.
Absolutely. And something, if you think about it, if this had been the last film, it would have really went off on a high note if it had been. I mean, I'm glad it wasn't the last film, but if it had to be the last film, I think this would have really ended it on a real high note, on a real sort of celebratory feel to the series.
And also, the ending scene where all the monsters gang up and kick the ever-loving shit out of King Ghidorah, I hold as one of the best monster battles in cinema history.
I agree.
Now let's move on to Godzilla's Revenge. This is... Now, as we mentioned before, Destroy All Monsters was meant to be the final film. It really wasn't, and they made this film. And this is where you see sort of an influence of the Gamera films, I think, because pretty much all the Gamera films, with the exception of the second one, had a child character. And I think in this they were trying to play on the success of the Gamera films, which I find to be really ironic because the Gamera films were clearly ripping off Godzilla, and now you see the Godzilla series ripping off the Gamera series. But this is considered to be one of the worst Godzilla films, and I 100% agree. This movie sucks. But I know you like this one.
Well, again, when we were talking about King Kong vs. Godzilla, one of the things you talked about was the effect of nostalgia, right? About how nostalgia has this very powerful pull on one's feelings, and that's what I feel about this film, is that I have a very great nostalgia for this film. I think it was the first Godzilla film I ever saw. The film, it had, even though I know it's footage from other films, because this film was probably made very cheaply, but it was great. You got to see all these different monsters. There's a little boy who was being bullied, who fantasized about things and wanted to escape to Monster Island, and he was friends with Minya, even though Minya had a really annoying voice. But I liked it. When I was a kid, I loved it.
Godzilla says I should learn how to fight my own battles.
There's some important life lessons to learn from a monster.
Important life lessons. The movie ends where the kid pretty much joins the gang.
Well, they accept him into their gang. He was accepted.
I have a feel this kid's gonna grow up to be it's gonna be a freaking gang. He's gonna be like the freaking criminal. Yeah, he's gonna be like the criminals who kidnapped him.
That's another thing I like about this film. You could tell that, I guess, that they wanted to sort of. I wonder if they wanted to sort of. Because Yakuza films and crime films were big at the time, if they wanted to sort of interject some of that into the film as well. But again, I know it's by no means a cinematic masterpiece. Yeah. But again, I think in terms of nostalgia for the series, this is one that rates very highly with me, because it was one of the first ones I saw, and we used to get repeated constantly, on TV, in the late 70s, early 80s. You would see it all the time on the independent stations.
Yeah. I do want to point out that I actually find it to be kind of hard to believe that this was one of Ishiro Honda's Godzilla films. I feel like at this point he was just kind of a director for hire, and I have a feeling that, because I know at this point he was actually getting burnt out on the Godzilla films and monster films in general, even though he still maintained that the first Godzilla film was his masterpiece. He was getting burnt out on it, and I could kind of understand. And at this point, you could tell he's a director for hire.
Definitely. I mean, he wouldn't direct a Godzilla film for another, 6 or 7 years afterwards, right?
6 years, I believe.
Yeah, he wouldn't. So that's understandable. I can understand how this film could burn somebody out too. I can understand that, especially when you went from the heights of what he was doing with the first Godzilla film, or even what he was doing with Kurosawa. As an assistant to Kurosawa. I mean, the heights that he had achieved, and now he's making this film that's the a large, there's a whole bunch of sort of, other footage cut in from other movies. It's really a hodgepodge kind of film.
Now we come to the 70s era of Godzilla, which even though they're technically part of the Showa era, they're so different from the films that came before that I would almost call the 70s Godzilla films an entirely different series. Now, in the 70s Godzilla films, Godzilla was an outright superhero. Prior to this, he was either a villain or an anti-hero, but in these films, they very much made Godzilla the hero of these films. Now, these films were very much in a Saturday matinee style, and were almost following a television format in the sense that Godzilla was a superhero, and he was fighting the monster of the week, or monster of the year in the case of these films. And these films were very much catered to children. And we begin the 70s era of Godzilla with 1971's Godzilla vs. Hedorah, or Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster as it was known here in the US. Now, Bill, since this is your favorite Godzilla sequel, I'm going to let you take the reins on this one.
Okay, sure. Well, again, it is my favorite Godzilla sequel, and one of the reasons why I think is because it has everything I love about late 60s, early 70s Japanese cinema, like in one film. It has like the animation, it has like the psychedelics scenes in the club. The music of the film is really interesting. There's this sort of acid rock part of it too. But again, I think that Yoshimitsu Banno, I believe, is the director. What I really like about it is they really took this in a totally different direction. He really sort of broke out of the usual Godzilla formula, and he really made it a very original film, right? Not only original in the sort of the look of the film, but also in the approach to its message. Because obviously the first Godzilla, and as we talked about in some of the other Godzilla sequels, there has been social commentary, political commentary in it. But the approach that Banno takes in this film, I think is very different than we've seen in, let's say, the Honda films, early on. I know some people complain that there's too much lecturing in the film. They're too weird. There's even is it too graphic? Right? There's scenes of skeletons and once Hedorah flies over and has that poisonous gas, kills people and children and things like that.
Which I want to point that out really quick is this film was very much catered to children, yet it does work as kind of a horror film as well. And I don't know if that signifies a difference of attitudes between America and Japan when it comes to children's cinema. But what do you think of that?
No, I totally agree, because I think you also see this, maybe not to the same extent in Hedorah, maybe not to the same extent that you see it in the later sequels, but it's true. I mean, in Godzilla vs. Gigan, there's some scenes that are sort of eyebrow raising for Americans thinking that this is a children's film. So I guess we'll talk about that when we get to those. But I totally agree. I think so. And Hedorah is an amazing villain in this film. He's horrifying. In terms of not just the destruction that he does to the urban environment, but also to the sort of natural environment.
I actually think Ghidorah could work in a more serious Godzilla film too. Absolutely. Even in some of the newer Godzilla films that they're trying to make now, I don't know about the legendary universe that they're making, but maybe if they do a sequel to Shin Godzilla, I could see Hedorah in that universe.
Sure, absolutely, I agree. And again, I think the film works on many different levels. I mean, obviously, the most explicit criticism in the film is against pollution, right? Against the sort of the destruction of the environment through chemicals and through garbage and the sort of the byproducts of capitalist society. But also, I mean, the film also tackles things like corporate responsibility. Are corporations responsible to not only their consumers or to their stockholders, but are they also responsible to the planet itself? Political apathy you see in the film. But to me, the really interesting issue in this film is the question of how effective is the counterculture in solving problems. Because in the film, right, we see sort of hippies, we saw sort of a counterculture, and they all seem to, all they want to do is just get stoned or just go and party, So I think there's this real question of, okay, we have this counterculture and they speak very loudly and they have very brash ideas, but are they putting them into practice?
It's I know in the movie they were talking about they wanted to hold some kind of party on this mountain by Mount Fuji, I think, to raise awareness for pollution. And it made me think, though, how is that really going to do shit?
Right, and I think that's like a critique of. I really think that's a critique of the counterculture of almost like Woodstock. Like, what did Woodstock really accomplish in that way? And I also think too. But one of the things I think that Banner does a good job of as well as is showing that even though the individual might be helpless in fighting this, if we do band together, if there is more collectivism, if we do sort of band together, maybe we can do something about this in terms of making corporations more responsible for what they do, or even in our own lives, how we live our own lives in terms of the relationship that we have to the environment. So again, I think that obviously Hedorah is the sort of the in-your-face sort of symbol of pollution, but there's a lot of other political and social concerns and issues going on in the film.
I know this was Banno's only Godzilla film, and I know producer Tomoki Tanaka, who produced all the Godzilla films and even conceived the original idea for Godzilla, he was in the hospital at the time they were making this, so he really couldn't oversee production, and apparently when he saw this movie, he was like violently pissed off, and according to him, Banno ruined Godzilla, and I'm just thinking, really?
Right.
You're saying he ruined Godzilla after Godzilla's Revenge?
Absolutely.
But he actually, Tanaka banned Banno from ever making another Godzilla movie.
Right.
But ironically, Banno ended up being one of the executive producers for the 2014 Godzilla film.
Interesting. Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I think Banno had an idea to make a sequel, because if you notice, right, at the end of Godzilla vs. Hedorah...
Oh, they totally hint at a sequel.
Exactly, that another Hedorah is going to be born, And I think that there was actually... that Banno did start writing some of that sequel, or write a script for that, but obviously after the executives, I guess, at Toho were sort of aghast. And again, I think that really shows you the sort of the switch over from the sort of old school kind of filmmaking versus the new school. And I even saw that, I guess, in America too. When you had sort of the old studio system, the old studios, and all of a sudden you had all these sort of young maverick directors coming along, wanting to sort of shake things up. So I guess you also had that as well in Japan as well. Now, having said that, even though I love the film, I'm not going to say that it doesn't have its issues.
I actually want to point out a few issues. You had the little kid, which sort of... this does kind of fit together with Godzilla's Revenge, and it seems like this one very much has a Gamera influence, like an influence of the Gamera series, where you have a little kid who, for some reason, they never explain it, but it seems like he has some psychic connection to Godzilla, and even making Godzilla a defender of the Earth was... you could tell was almost like them taking that off of Gamera. I think it's the ultimate irony, because Gamera was a ripoff of Godzilla, and now you see the Godzilla series ripping off Gamera. I also want to point out, in the movie, the little kid has these Godzilla toys. And in context of that universe, that's actually really insensitive. Those monsters have killed millions upon millions of people in that universe, and that kid... there's some company that's making toys based on these monsters. I know I'm reaching way too deep into this, but it's like, there's that scene where the kid, I don't know if it's like his older brother or something, but he's like, so Godzilla's your favorite, huh? That's the equivalent of saying, so Osama bin Laden's your favorite, huh?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, it would be almost like a 9/11 playset or something, getting. Yeah. But again, I think this also connects over to your discussion about the connection of the child and the perspective of the child. And again, I think what Banno was trying to do in the film was talk about generations, about how sort of younger generations need to sort of understand what is going on in the world, and they need to sort of prepare for these things, because obviously the older generation is apathetic, or the older generation is turning a blind eye to this. So to me, it's a little bit different than Godzilla's Revenge, in the sense that in Godzilla's Revenge, I think it was just this idea of this child character identifying with the people in the audience.
But here's the thing, though: Godzilla's Revenge, I never really considered to officially be part of the Godzilla universe. Mm-hmm. This seems to be. I know they didn't really take continuity that seriously, but this is in a universe where Godzilla and these other monsters exist. And they're making toys based on these monsters in that universe. Right.
And again, I think that maybe that's a commentary also on sort of the corporatization, the commercialization of things. That even here's this this force that has been very destructive. There's a way for corporations to still make money off of it. You know what I mean? They could still turn something horrible, tragic, into something that makes money. and then that becomes absorbed into the mainstream. But again, it's not saying that the film is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that there's enough. I mean, really, there's enough ideas and enough styles for 5 movies in this movie, and I really like that. I really like how upfront it is, and it sort of moves away from the sort of buttoned down kind of industrial, military kind of scientific approach that maybe Honda had in his films. This sort of ultra modern. This idea that science will save us, that the sort of future of mankind is in space. That's what you get kind of in some of his the other movies, and I really like it. I think it's in a weird way, even though it's like kind of like psychedelic and out there. I think it's a more down to earth movie than maybe some of the later Honda films.
Okay, and this is one that I do appreciate this film a lot, but I think it's one that I appreciate more than I really like. Like, I think you like this one a little more than I do. I do appreciate this film. I think it's arguably one of the most unique Godzilla films ever made, but it's not one of my personal favorites, though. Although I will say this is probably the closest we'll ever get to a Godzilla vs. the Blob movie. And there's actually a scene in this movie that I swear Larry Hagman ripped off for his sequel to The Blob, Beware the Blob. Because if you remember in Beware the Blob, there's that scene where the 2 main characters are in their car, and the Blob starts covering their car and
Yes, absolutely.
coming down over their windshield. And there's a scene much like that in this movie.
Yeah, I can see that, absolutely.
So I think... I'm sure Larry Hagman might deny this, but I have a feeling Larry Hagman might have ripped that scene off for Beware the Blob. I could be wrong, though.
No, it's interesting. I also see a connection in a weird way between this film and, have you ever heard the punk band The Dead Kennedys have a song called Keepone Factory, which is about, I guess, in a town, a prefecture in Japan, a company was poisoning the water or something was going on and really made the people in the town very sick, and the corporation did not want to take any responsibility for it, which I think, again, Bano, I think also references in the film. So there's a weird kind of connection with the Dead Kennedys in there as well. And I also love the song Save the Earth. The song that is sung in the nightclub sequence is I think is awesome.
I actually want to point out these 70s Godzilla films had some great music in them.
They did. I love the scores. I do absolutely love the scores, and I love Ifukube's scores. I do love them, but one thing with Ifukube's scores, I feel for Godzilla, they kind of got samey after a while. So it was really nice to see some of these other Mananabe, I think, right? Chirio Mananabe might have done the score for this, but I really like some of the other scores. I know they kind of got a little campy at the end too, but they're cool. I like them.
All right. Now we come to 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan, which I think is one of the most underrated Godzilla films ever made. This is one that I hear so many people crapping all over. And it's not a perfect movie. There's a lot of, usage of stock footage in the film. And there are scenes where, you see Gigan and King Ghidorah flying where they're clearly puppets. At the same time, though, and maybe this is nostalgia, but I adore this film. I really do. And this is one of the Godzilla films that really introduced me to the franchise. As I mentioned before, my first Godzilla film was King Kong vs. Godzilla. My second was actually Godzilla 1985, which we won't talk about till we get to the Heisei series, but this was my third or fourth Godzilla film. My uncle actually gave this to me in this VHS set where it came with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, and I don't remember if I watched this or Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla first, but once again, this is one of the Godzilla films that really introduced me to this franchise, and I still watch this movie all the time, and non-ironically, too. I still have the old VHS of this, and when I'm bored, I just pop it in. This has become one of my favorite Godzilla films, and I mean that non-ironically. I adore this film, but what do you think of this?
I agree. I mean, it's a fun movie. It's violent. It's got a lot of monsters in it. It's great. I think it's a really good movie. Like I said, I'd much rather watch this one. I know this is going to sort of, fly in the face of, people's opinions about the Godzilla series, but I'd rather watch this one than Monster Zero. Or even some of the other ones. I'd much rather watch this, I mean, come on, you get to see Godzilla and Ghidorah talk to each other, right? That's all. I love that scene, And again, Gigan's an awesome monster. I think, the buzzsaw and the hooks, it's really cool. Again, I think it's a fun movie, violent. It's got a good pacing to it. I don't think it really drags anywhere. again, I understand the recycled footage, and I also know that I think there's a recycled score too. I think the score to the film only has maybe like 2 new pieces, and everything else is recycled from other Toho films, so other Godzilla, like Frankenstein Conquers the World. Like it's recycled from things, so it's almost like a greatest hits of Ifukube. You know? But yeah, I agree. I think I enjoy it very much. And again, this goes back to but there are some things in the film that kind of do raise eyebrows, like I said, like you said about with Hedorah in terms of it being a kids movie. Like isn't the part like where the hero calls his girlfriend a hard bitch?
You're a hard bitch.
Yeah, which is kind of an odd thing, you know. And but anyways, I enjoy it very much, you know. I know the original concept actually was much more complex. That it was like King Ghidorah, Gigan, and Megalon. And they were being controlled by an alien brain that was trying to take over the Earth. And there was a statue of an Inca god, and I think it got blood on it, and it comes alive and fights. The original concept sounds awesome. It sounds really good. And I think they kind of used some of that, like, I think they took some of the original concept and used it, obviously, in Godzilla versus Megalon, and then some of the stuff with King Caesar. I think they took that out. But again, it's a really great film.
Yeah, and I actually really like the characters in this film too, like especially the main character who's like a manga artist.
Right.
Like, for some reason I feel like this character is, even though I'm not a manga artist, I can't draw for shit, I feel like this character is what it would be like if an adult Godzilla fan was a main character in a Godzilla film, because you could tell he's a fan of like monster stories, because a lot of the mangas he writes are about monsters, which again, I'm surprised those have a market in this universe, but once again, it feels like if a Godzilla fan it feels like if one of us was the main character of a Godzilla film, and I find him to be a very likable character, and I especially like that one hippie guy who's with them, the one who scares him with the piece of corn in that one scene. Oh, he must have thought it was a gun.
It's funny though, because that's a character I think you start to see like in the late 60s, early 70s. It's almost like this feminized protagonist that actually becomes more manly through sort of facing fears and facing the outside world. Like they're very cloistered. They're very sort of
his girlfriend. You could tell his girlfriend's very much like
she's more of like the boss, so like more of that sort of, she's more masculine almost than he is.
She even asks, "Are you a man?" at one point when he's. Yeah, I could see that definitely. Yeah. And also the villains of the movie I find to be very interesting, and when you think about it, actually kind of sympathetic, because the villains of the film are these alien cockroaches that take human form. You find out that they were from a planet similar to Earth, but the people of that planet destroyed themselves with pollution, and these alien cockroaches want to conquer Earth because they need a place to go, and when you really break it down, they are actually sympathetic characters. And I feel like if this was a more serious Godzilla film, they would have tried to make them a little more three-dimensional. But I think really when you stop to think about it, you do sympathize with the cockroaches in the film.
And they're creepy villains too, even the way they're presented.
Yeah.
You know, Fukuda, how he presents the aliens in the film, it's kind of creepy. It's kind of, not what you would usually expect in terms of the great flourish of past villains, like in Destroy All Monsters or in Monster Zero. You know,
yeah. I mean, they're freaking cockroaches, and I hate cockroaches.
So do I.
I know I mentioned before I have no problem with spiders, but cockroaches and beetles just freak me the fuck out.
Well, then you must have really been freaked out by our next film.
We'll get to that. But once again, oddly enough, with these characters, you do get sort of a social commentary in the film about pollution, the same as Hedorah, the fact that they came from a planet that wiped themselves out because of pollution. And even at the end of the film, one of the characters says, "I guess one day the cockroaches are going to inherit the world." So you do get some social commentary, maybe not as much, or maybe not as in your face as Hedorah, but it's definitely in the film. And what do you think of that ending song when Godzilla and Anguirus are going out into the water again?
Oh, the Monster March or something like that? Godzilla's Monster March. I love it too, yeah.
I love that song. And it's funny how you mentioned that Megalon was originally going to be in this, because I swear they mentioned Megalon in that song.
Oh, that's interesting. I'll have to listen to it again, because I have the soundtrack for it. I have I do have the soundtrack for it, so I'll have to listen to it. But I love those ones, and I guess that's what they did. Like, again, to sort of appeal to the sort of the kiddie market or whatever, right? A lot of times they would have the score, but then they would create like kind of pop songs based in the movie, and then have those as 45s, like as singles to put out there. And I think that's one of them, right? And I know in Megalon they do one too, right?
Yeah,
they have a pop song in that movie as well.
We'll get to that one. Actually, let's get to that one. Now we come to 1973's Godzilla vs. Megalon, which is a very maligned Godzilla film. I want to point out that this one is directed by Jun Fukuda, who also directed Godzilla vs. Gigan. Jun Fukuda, he directed a lot of Godzilla films. Like, I would say him and Honda, at least during the Showa era, were like the two main Godzilla directors. Of course, Honda really gets praised, whereas Jun Fukuda, I think, gets really maligned. But this one is one that's very maligned by Godzilla fans, and probably for good reason, because this is a pretty bad movie, but it's the definition of a guilty pleasure for me. I have a soft spot for this film, I really do. And this film, I believe, is in the public domain, as the same with Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. I believe the American cuts of this and Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster are in the public domain, at least in America. Of course, if you ask Toho, there is no public domain to them. What do you think of this one?
Yeah, I enjoy it too. I do. I enjoy it too. Obviously, it's not. It's kind of threadbare. I know there's like some scenes where, like, I think at the end where, like, you could tell that they were waiting for Fukuda to say action, and like it's the protagonist, the little boy, and Jet Jaguar, and they're just standing there. And then, like, so it is threadbare. I think they probably, it looks like that, they could have tightened it up with editing, And I also heard that there was actually deleted scenes from this that they didn't add in. And there's actually one deleted scene that I was reading about the leader of Seatopia, talking about whether, the moral implications of, like, unleashing Megalon on the surface world. And I thought that would have been interesting.
That would have been interesting, because I want to point out the people of Seatopia, very much like the cockroaches in Godzilla vs. Gigan, they are sympathetic, because when you think about it, they're doing it to protect themselves. They've been threatened by the nuclear testing, and this one does have some social commentary in it as well. Obviously done in a much more kiddie way, but they are sympathetic, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Even though, when you think about it, they're kind of assholes, though, because they send Megalon after Japan. I don't believe Japan was the one who was doing the nuclear testing. Why are they sending him after Japan?
That's a good point.
They are kind of assholes, but they're still sympathetic, though.
No, absolutely, and I don't know if it's harder to sort of take somebody seriously that's dressed up as, like, in a Roman outfit, right? Wasn't the guy, like, wearing a tunic in the movie and was but no, it's a great movie. Again, I love Jet Jaguar. I think he's awesome.
This is where you definitely see an influence of TV shows like Ultraman and Zone Fighter, which were very popular at this time. And I heard that Jet Jaguar was originally, he was going to be the only character in this movie. Mm-hmm. Like, Godzilla was kind of added last minute because they figured Godzilla would have more marquee value. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I do enjoy this one. I wouldn't say it's a great movie, but it is a fun one. It's just pure fun.
And I think also, by the time of this movie coming out, I think, like, Toho was really grasping at straws for ideas, because I think, right, Jet Jaguar was, there was a contest at Toho, and Jet Jaguar was sort of a kid designed it for a contest, and so I think Toho at this point was like, we need ideas, we need something to enliven this, But I also think too that I heard that with Godzilla vs. Gigan and Godzilla vs. Megalon, some of the later sequels in the 70s, that Toho was really hit by the oil crisis. So there was an economic crisis and then the oil crisis
which
of the 70s.
Which could also explain, like, a lot of the stock footage in these films, because economically they probably didn't have a lot of money to make these films. I actually heard, this could just be a rumor, but I heard this film was only shot in, like, 3 weeks.
Right. You could. I think you could see it.
Yeah.
But it's still great, though. It's still great. There's, like, some great fights in it. It's almost like a wrestling match, right, between Godzilla and Jet Jaguar, and you get to see Gigan again, and Megalon.
And I find Megalon to be an interesting villain. Like, he's basically a giant cockroach with drills for hands, and he shoots bombs out of his mouth, and has that one horn on his head that shoots lightning out of it. He's an interesting villain.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, this is a fun one. what do you think of the Jet Jaguar song at the end?
Oh, I love it. Jet Jaguar. I love that song. It's great. I'm a big sucker. I love the songs.
And I know
at the
they
end.
lampoon that in Mystery Science Theater.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Where they say stuff like his head looks like Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, which is actually really funny. But again, one other thing I want to say about this film was that you see what you were talking about before about the difference in sensibilities between American children's films and Japanese children's films. Because at one point, right, don't you see like there's truck drivers in the film, and inside the cab you could see like Playboy centerfolds like on the like plastered inside the cab.
You see, all I have is an old VHS of the movie, and I think that might have been cut out.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure that scene might have been cut out when it was brought here to America,
right,
for like American children audiences. So I've never seen the movie with that scene.
Right. Actually, I saw the movie, which is odd, was when the first American Godzilla film came out. What was that? 1998. That Sci-Fi Channel at the time played like a marathon of Godzilla films, and they actually showed Godzilla vs. Gigan, Godzilla vs. Megalon, but they were beautiful. They were like they were not American prints. They must have been international prints that Toho prepared. They were like letterbox. They were beautiful, and that scene, even though it was on regular cable TV, you could see the centerfolds in the background.
Okay.
Like they didn't obscure it. I just remember being shocked by seeing that. You know, the one thing I remember about the film, which is really might seem really odd, seeing is that there's like a robot and monsters and all this crazy stuff. Was the one thing I remember being as a kid is early in the film when you see the little boy that's kind of like the protagonist in the film, and he's in water and he's like on some weird like dolphin pedal boat or something. I remember being a little kid and being like, what is that? Like I was like fascinated by that. Like that's the one memory that like I retained from that film, seeing it the first time, was not so much the monsters or anything. It was like that pedal boat.
I actually want to point out the characters in this. This is the only Godzilla film that doesn't have female main characters. You see women in the background and stuff, but in this film, the main characters are these two men and a little boy. And some Godzilla fans have speculated that these two characters are a gay couple. If that's the case, it's pretty progressive for a 1973 film. But I've also heard people make pedophilia jokes with the little boy being there, but I don't know. To me, it doesn't really matter. I don't think they really thought that far ahead when
I don't think so either. I think again, it's almost like a child's fantasy, like a young boy's fantasy, right? You're probably not gonna have women or girls around, right? It's just guys getting together, older guys. You know what I mean? Like, so I don't know if I'd go that far with it. I think it's appealing to a sort of the young boys in the audience, like girls are icky, we don't want them around or whatever, So this film is just like just a very sort of manly sort of or sort of an adventure for guys.
All right. And now let's move on to what I think is the best of the 70s Godzilla films, which is also directed by Jun Fukuda, and I think in this film you see some of Fukuda's best work, and that is Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. And as I mentioned before when I was talking about Godzilla vs. Megalon, I have a lot of nostalgia for this one because it was one of the films that really introduced me to the franchise, and my uncle got it for me on a VHS set where it came with Godzilla vs. Gigan. And I actually think, even though Godzilla vs. Megalon came in between this and Godzilla vs. Gigan, I actually think this one is actually a really good double feature with Gigan in a lot of ways. It even has a similar plot line in a lot of ways as well. But what do you think of this one?
Yeah, I enjoyed this film a lot too. I agree with you. I love the look of Mechagodzilla. Absolutely love the look. I always thought it was, even when I was a child, I was fascinated by it. But what I really like about this film is that it has like this mystical tone to it. Right, when you have King Caesar, and you have like the worshippers on Okinawa, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you have the aliens who have this technology, and then you have the sort of the Okinawans who have this sort of mystical, spiritual kind of approach to the world. So it's almost like this sort of the spiritual versus the technological. Like what is going to be sort of, and I wonder in some ways that was reflective of Japan at the time in the 70s themselves. Like which way were they going to go? Were they going to sort of move more and become this technological, scientifically based society, or were they going to sort of embrace the sort of the Shinto, the spiritual aspects of their lives as well? So I think I see it as a real interesting film that really comments, I think, on where Japan was going, like looking towards the rest of the 70s.
I actually, King Caesar or Seesaw, I used to call him Seesaw when I was younger, but he used to freak me out a little bit as a little kid. I was like, ugh, I wouldn't want to meet that thing in a dark alley.
That's funny because I almost see like I think King Caesar is the closest to Mothra.
Oh no,
Like,
definitely.
you know what I mean? Like,
because he has that mystical background.
even a song, right? Doesn't the there's
Yeah.
like a princess on Okinawa that sings a song to bring like King Caesar back or something like that. So there's even connections with that as well.
And I also think this one has the most interesting story out of all the 70s Godzilla films in a lot of ways, and I think this is definitely the most well-made of all the 70s Godzilla films, and I think that could be because this was the 20th anniversary of the original Godzilla. They really wanted to go all out with this movie, and I think, once again, it's the best of the 70s era of Godzilla. I think this is where you really, even though it is kind of playing to that kiddie audience, I think they were trying to also appeal to the adults as well in the audience.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's a much more violent film, right? Isn't there a point where like there's arterial spray, where like Godzilla has arterial spray, which you really only ever saw like in the Yakuza films or in the samurai films. So yeah, I agree with that, and it's actually a good action film. It actually it's paced really well. Like I said, I think Fukuda really is an underrated director. I think that he in these films he really gave it his all. Maybe not so much in Megalon, but for Godzilla vs Mechagodzilla, I absolutely think that he really gave it his all. And again, I think it's the action sequences are really well staged.
I mean, it has some cheesy stuff in it, like the whole thing of where for some reason Godzilla becomes Magneto is very weird, but still, I think, compared to the ones that came before, this is where you really saw them. I don't want to say they were trying to make the series serious again, but they were definitely taking it a little more seriously than what they have been before, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. What do you think about the aliens, the sort of the ape aliens?
Oh, I like them a lot. Especially, when they transform into, like, back to their true forms. Those were scenes that always stuck out to me when I was a little kid watching this movie. And overall, I think it's just a phenomenal Godzilla film.
Right. You can see, I think, with the aliens, you could really see the influence of Planet of the Apes. Obviously, I guess at the same time, there was a miniseries in Japan called Army of the Apes, which was like it was like a kind of a Japanese version of Planet of the Apes, which I guess had been really popular. So it kind of makes sense that at the time there was sort of this sort of ape mania, in Japan at the time. So that was, that I guess that influenced that, And then that show Army of the Apes, because we were just talking about Mystery Science Theater, was that I guess an American producer, Sandy Frank, took some of the episodes of Army of the Apes and recut them into a movie called Time of the Apes.
Okay.
And then it was on one of the early episodes of Mystery Science Theater they actually watched Time of the Apes.
All right. And now let's move on to the final film of the Showa era of Godzilla, Terror of Mechagodzilla, which was a direct sequel to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. And this one is directed by Ishiro Honda, and this was Ishiro Honda's final Godzilla film, and this is one, I'll admit, this used to be one of my least favorite Godzilla films, but that was because the old VHS I had, or I still have, this old VHS in the movie that was actually an edited version of the film. Later on, I saw this movie on, like, Netflix. For some reason, I wanted to watch it on Netflix. And it was almost an entirely different film. And it turns out the VHS that I had actually cut out the ending scene, which is a very tragic scene. And I think they tried to make it, for some reason, the VHS I have of the movie tried to make it a more kid-friendly movie. And this is where it's still very much in the tone of the 70s Godzilla films, but I think this was an attempt to really try to make Godzilla... Obviously, he's the hero in this, but it was an attempt to make Godzilla serious again, I think.
Mm-hmm. And to me, that's funny because I do like this film, but it's probably my least favorite of the '70s Godzillas because I think, and I don't know because Honda came back, but you got that kind of like creakiness come back into, whereas like the other ones, very groovy '70s kind of they had very different feels. The Terror of Mechagodzilla, I think, goes back to that kind of scientific modernist view that we had in some of the later Honda films.
True, but I feel like this one really does have a very somber tone to it, very much like the original Godzilla. Obviously, I will never say that this is as good of a film as the original Godzilla, but I do appreciate that this film tried to go back to sort of the tone of the original while still being in the style of the 70s era of Godzilla.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think that to me the most compelling character is Katsura, right? The cyborg.
Yes.
She's an awesome character, and right, it's the only instance of Toho of nudity.
Yeah.
Right in the Godzilla series is when you see the Katsura, the cyborg being sort of serviced or put together or whatever.
Yeah.
But again, I think like I mean I like Titanosaurus like as the monster, but again not the most. I like Megalon and Gigan like much more. Hedorah much more.
I want to point something out about Titanosaurus. I've introduced my little sister to Godzilla. And Titanosaurus is actually one of her favorite kaijus.
Yeah, I can see that.
For some reason, she really loves Titanosaurus.
Who's reminded me of a snork. And you ever see those shows that show they were like kind of like a ripoff of the Smurfs? They were like underwater Smurfs.
No,
I don't know, for some reason he always reminded me of like he would be in the show The Snorks. But anyway, I heard that the original...
I agree with you about Katsura. I find her to be a very sympathetic character, and I want to talk about that tragic ending where she dies. Once again, that was cut out of my VHS of the film, so for years I never saw that ending, and when I saw it on Netflix a while back, I was like, holy shit, I've been watching the wrong movie all these years, and I don't think it's one of the best Godzilla films. I know there are some Godzilla fans who really praise this one, but I do appreciate this one a lot, but I don't like it as much as the first Mechagodzilla movie. I think the first Mechagodzilla movie is a far more entertaining film.
I wonder if some of that praise for this film is because this was Honda's last Godzilla film. You know what I mean?
It could be.
So like that could be like they want to give him his sort of the sort of the attention and the sort of kudos that he deserves for the film.
And once again, it's not a flawless film. I actually don't think the film's very well written. But I do want to point out that I think this is the only Godzilla film to be written by a woman, because I know a woman wrote the screenplay for this, or wrote the original story for this.
Right, because that was another story contest, right? I think
Yeah.
that Toho had another story contest where they were sort of, they were asking the public to give them ideas.
And I just want to say that I think the woman who wrote this came up with a really good story idea. I just don't think the film overall was very well written. But granted, I don't know if she wrote the screenplay that was used for this film, or only wrote like a first draft or something like that.
And again, I mean, coming after the Fukuda films that were very sort of lively films. Again, I think that Honda was probably too conservative, maybe in his filming of the movie itself.
True, but once again, he tried to go for a more serious approach than Fukuda. But here's the thing: the serious approach works for like the original Godzilla. Works for maybe a few of his later Godzilla films, but by the time you got to the 70s, when I watch a 70s Godzilla film, I just want to be purely entertained. I'm not really thinking too much about... Like, if I want to think, I watch the original Godzilla. If I just want to have a fun time, I watch one of the 70s Godzilla films.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could see that. Absolutely.
And this was the final film of the Showa era, and I think they intended this to be the final Godzilla film, because I believe this was like the lowest grossing Godzilla film at the time, and they wouldn't revive the series till close to 10 years later. And technically, if you want to go continuity-wise, technically all these 70s Godzilla films are supposed to take place before the events of Destroy All Monsters, so continuity-wise, that's really the final film. But as a final film to this series, do you think Terror of Mechagodzilla is a good send-off or not?
I mean, I think it is. It's again, maybe it's because I know Honda came back, so it's nice to bookend. It just seems to have a good symmetry to it, where like he did the first one and he comes back for the last one. But again, I think that some of the problems that I have with some of the other Honda sequels, are exhibited in this film as well. And again, I do like the film. Don't get me wrong, I do like the film. But after coming off of the other films, which yes are more kiddie, are more juvenile, but they're more exciting. Like they move, they have like the music is like funky kind of music. It's weird. It seems like a film from a different time frame.
And I think this is the only 70s Godzilla film that doesn't have a song.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I was disappointed with that.
This needed a song.
Absolutely.
Something about Titanosaurus.
Yeah. Right. And that's funny because Titanosaurus, the monster, right? The original idea was that it was two monsters that joined together to make this, giant monster.
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
Right, and I think it's funny because they use that with Destroya later on.
Yes.
Right. Where the sort of the little crab monsters or whatever created, became the big monster.
Mm-hmm. Now I want to touch on some of the influence that the Showa era of Godzilla had on American culture, because these films, while they came out in Japan in the early 70s, they weren't released in America until the late 70s. But after these films, you got the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla cartoon, which you could tell was definitely influenced by a lot of the later Showa Godzilla films. But I know we talked about the Godzilla cartoon before, but what are some more of your thoughts on that one?
Well, you gotta remember, I mean, I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s. I was a child during those times, so I never knew that Godzilla was supposed to be taken seriously. You know, so I mean, I loved I think it was on channel NBC. I think the original Godzilla cartoon show, and I loved that. You know, I loved anything that had to do with Godzilla. So, but again, it was more of a sort of a pop culture sort of phenomenon more than an intellectual one or an artistic one. One that I thought was geared towards children. I didn't even know that, you know, that there were quite a few films that weren't geared towards children. You know, so for me, the influence at the time was that this was, again, a pop culture phenomenon that, you know, was geared towards children. It was, you know, fantastical and giant monsters and destruction. So it really appealed. I could see why it would obviously would appeal to, you know, children at the time.
Yeah. This is one. Now, I grew up more in the 90s. I was born in the 90s, but I really grew up in like the early 2000s. But Cartoon Network used to have a lot of reruns of this. Cartoon Network had a lot of reruns of the old Hanna-Barbera cartoons, Scooby-Doo, of course, but like other ones as well. And this is one because I was already a big Godzilla fan, and of course, this being a Godzilla cartoon was going to appeal to me as a little kid, because I also really grew up on like Scooby-Doo and stuff like that. So to have a Godzilla show done in the style of like Scooby-Doo, of course, appealed to me a lot when I was a little kid. And I think it's a really entertaining show. I mean, I haven't watched a lot of these episodes in a while, so I can't really say how they're going to hold up for me. But I remember one in particular that really interested me, where the main characters end up on this island, and there's like these sirens on the island, you know, from Greek myth, and like these women who turn into these creatures, and then they all form together into one giant creature that Godzilla fights in it. And also you had Godzilla's nephew, who I always thought was his son, who is Godzuki, but because of him being Godzuki, I always thought, and as you mentioned, a lot of American fans always thought that Minya was Godzuki.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, it's funny, you mentioned that actually sounds like a cool villain, but the only thing, even as a child, the one thing that bothered me about the cartoon was that you never saw any of the other Toho characters. Like, you never saw Mothra, you never saw Rodan, you never saw, you know, Ghidorah. And that was one thing I thought that, one of the things I didn't like about the cartoon when I was a child was, I thought the villains, you know, the other monsters and villains just were not as good as what I saw in the films.
Okay. Well, of course, as an adult, I realized that, well, that's all they could get the rights to, but what do you... I've never read... I know in the late 70s, Marvel put out a line of comic books with Godzilla in them, where he apparently fought the Avengers and stuff like that. I've never read those comics. Have you ever read them?
I read a few of them, because I was a comic fan in the late 70s, early 80s, and actually I have the same critique as I do of the cartoon, is that the comic books did not have the Toho villains in it. They just did not have compelling villains. Like you said, there was occasional, which I thought was an odd kind of thing, even then, like crossovers with like the Marvel universe. So now Godzilla actually exists in the Marvel universe. Does he not? Anyway, same thing. I thought that the comic book and the cartoon were definite lesser than the films. Like, the films were the great things to see. The comics, the TV series, they were okay, but just did not have the same. I did not have the same interest in them as I did in the films.
All right. And I think because of a lot of these Showa Godzilla films, especially the late 70s ones, for a while, a lot of people thought Godzilla was in the public domain, because I know there are at least two Godzilla films that are public domain here in America, or at least they were for a while. But like, there's this early 80s teen sex comedy called Love Lines, and there's a bully in the movie whose name is actually Godzilla. And being how litigious Toho is now, I'm surprised that movie didn't get, like, the crap suit off of them, but I don't know, like, maybe they made a deal with Toho, or maybe Toho wasn't as litigious back in the 80s as they are now, or maybe it just fell under their radar at the time.
Right. I always remember in was it the Savage Steve Holland's comedy, One Crazy Summer? There's a part where like somebody's dressed up kind of like in a Godzilla outfit, and there's like Japanese like developers, and they have a model of like what they're gonna build, and somebody throws a cigar and it lands inside the guy with the suit. So the guy's like and he's walking around and he's like stepping on the model like city, and like smoke is coming out of the costume. So obviously that was a Godzilla reference there. But yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think from what I remember, like, there was definitely like mentions of Godzilla. Actually, the show Sanford and Son, Fred Sanford was a big fan of Godzilla. He always mentioned Godzilla. A couple times he mentioned some. It's a really weird thing. Somebody on that staff must have been a kaiju fan, because they actually mentioned in the Ghidorah, that obscure Toho film, is actually mentioned on the show.
Okay.
And there was some other the Mushroom People, which I guess is a reference to a tango. So somebody on the Sanford and Son writing staff actually must have been a Godzilla fan, because they actually mentioned on the show like some pretty obscure references.
Yeah, you even had this was a show in the early 90s. I'm sure you've heard of it, but you were like a teenager in the early 90s, so you probably didn't watch it. But there was that show, The Rugrats, and on the show, like, one of the main characters watched this character called Riptar, movies about this character called Riptar, who was clearly Godzilla.
Right.
So you could see this influence of Godzilla in so many things in American pop culture.
It's like a cultural icon, absolutely. I mean,
and
you can't deny that.
Yeah, and like, just as much as King Kong, I would almost argue even more so than King Kong in a lot of ways. You even had like references to kaiju. Have you ever seen the movie Blue Sunshine, the late 70s film?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Right in the beginning, there was that party scene where the main character, for some reason, was referencing Rodan to some girl or something.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's just cool to me. I've always been fascinated by stuff that makes such a big impact on pop culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. I mean, and what I think is interesting, I mean, obviously in Japan, it was merchandised a lot, you know? But I think that the attempts to merchandise it in America are very interesting. So I remember, like, there was a line of toys in the late 70s called Shogun Warriors, which were kind of like these, like, anime-inspired kind of robots. And like they were big robots too. I don't know, you know, and they would shoot parts of their bodies out. Like you could shoot missiles and stuff. And they made a Godzilla one that really didn't look like Godzilla, but it was Godzilla. And like his like fist would shoot off, and there was like this flickering thing out of his mouth. I don't know if it was supposed to be his tongue or fire, but they actually had a Rodan one too. So there were attempts early on to try to sort of market it, not as much as like later on, you know, where there was definitely much more sustained campaign to market him. But even early on, like I found that really interesting, like the early attempts to market it here. I think there was a Godzilla board game and all different kind of things that they came out with, you know. But yeah, I found it fascinating as well.
Now, before we end this, I just want to ask you. Now, not counting the original Godzilla, which we both agree is a far deeper, far more intellectual, and far scarier film than the sequels would lead you to believe, but looking at the sequels, like the Showa era from Raids Again to Terror of Mechagodzilla, how would you describe the Showa era to somebody who maybe only saw the original Godzilla or hasn't seen the original Godzilla at all? Like, how would you recommend it to somebody who's a grown adult who's just starting to get into Godzilla? Or are these films that you could only that you feel like could only be enjoyed if you really grew up on them?
No, I don't think so. I guess, but it's hard because there's so many of them. So, like, overall, I mean, I think I would recommend, I'd be like, listen, if you want to see, like, great, you know, 60s science fiction, if you're into fantasy films, check these out. They're great. You know, not every one is going to be a gem, but I think in each film, at least there's something. I don't think any of the Godzilla sequels are a total waste of time or have nothing to offer. Even in the ones that I like the least, I still find interesting things in them. You know, whether it's the special effects, the miniatures, the scores, the designs of the monsters, the fight scenes. There's always something to find in these films, and I think that you know, anybody, any age, can find something if they have an open mind enough.
All right. So that was our retrospective on the Showa era of Godzilla. The next time you'll be hearing us talking, we'll be talking about the Heisei Godzilla films. So catch you all at a later time.